that means that we didn't understand what Scripture is saying. We should change the interpretation. Because he pointed out, listen, the Bible is not a science book. And he gave many examples for it. He said, for example, even the planets are not named in the Bible. The Bible, he said, was written for our salvation, not as a science book. And he has this very famous quote where he says that he doesn't believe that the same God who has given us eyes and ears and reason and, ability to think would want us to abandon those abilities, when we think about nature and so on. So the way he saw this is the following. You see, okay, so he said there is a heliocentric model. The earth is really moving, the sun is at rest. So then came theologians and said, well, but look, if you look in the book of Joshua, let's say, in the book of Joshua, when Joshua fights against the Canaanites near the city of Gibeon, at one point Joshua asked the Lord to stop the sun in its course, for the day to be longer, and, so that he can beat those. And so the theologian said, look, it says that he stopped the sun and not the earth. So it's the sun that's moving. Galileo said, no, the Bible was written in a way that common people will understand what we're talking about. But it is much easier to prolong the day by stopping the spin of the earth, around its axis, than to start meddling with all the objects in the heavens, in order to stop the sun. So the interpretation has to be rewritten or understood. It's not, the text itself. So this was his main point, that the Scripture is correct, but we have to reinterpret when there appears to be a conflict. Now, the theologians said, what Galileo is a scientist, he shouldn't get involved in theology. That is our province. Only we are allowed to interpret Scripture, and so on. At the same time, it did not stop them from interfering in the science and claiming that his science was wrong. You see, so it was this type of conflict. It was not really a conflict between science and religion per se. So that's the answer to the first part of your question. Let's move on. What do you want next?
Well, to follow up on your first point, I think that's very useful because people who misunderstand this imagine it's a sort of 19th century debate about Darwinian evolution when it's very different. And as you noted, the Catholic Church had different models of scriptural interpretation. Sometimes it was literal, sometimes it was metaphorical. A verse that said God is a consuming fire doesn't mean that he's a Bunsen burner that exists out in space. So sometimes we have to move things from literal to metaphorical.
That's exactly what Galileo's point was. He said, if you would take everything in the Bible literally, it would require God, to have hands and legs and this and will, and sometimes get angry and sometimes get, and things like that. You attribute to God things that really are human things. Mm-hmm. And clearly that was not the intent.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. When I was looking in my notes for this episode, I have a quote from Cardinal Bellarmine, I think that in 1616, and he's commenting on Galileo's writings on this topic and curious on your take on this. So he says, if there were a true demonstration that the sun is at the center of the world and the earth in the third heaven, and that the sun does not circle the earth, but the earth circles the sun, then one would have to proceed with great care in explaining the scriptures that appear contrary, and say rather that we do not understand them, then what is demonstrated is false. But this is not a thing to be done in haste. And as for myself, I shall not believe that there are such proofs until they are shown to me. So what is the church expecting from Galileo? Do they want his case to be stronger, or?
So, well, you see, Roberto Bellarmino was a cardinal who at some level respected Galileo, but at some level was convinced that actually, if you read between the lines of what he says, there is at the moment no proof that the earth is actually moving. And he says, yeah, if there were such a proof, then we would have to think harder and, find perhaps other types of explanations. But, until then, I want to first see it. It basically says that he is very skeptical that such a proof will ever be available. So, yes, he was on the whole more moderate than some of his contemporaries, but still basically did not believe that the proof for the motion of the earth will ever actually be achieved.
And I believe he rules that Galileo cannot teach heliocentrism as a result of this writing. Is that correct?
He actually wrote a somewhat more moderate letter in support of Galileo, because there was the commissioner of the Inquisition who actually decided that Galileo not only could not defend and hold the idea of heliocentrism, but he couldn't teach it, he couldn't talk about it, he couldn't write about it. And Bellarmino's letter did not mention the teach or this, just that he couldn't hold that opinion, but that he couldn't teach or write. And Galileo used his letter actually in his defense when he was put on trial.
Okay, well, let's come to the trial itself. How does the trial begin? What does the church do or Galileo do to begin this?
Well, basically, Galileo, first of all, published that book, The Dialogue on the Chief Two World Systems. And in that book, which is written in the form of a conversation between three people, he has three people there. One of them kind of represents Galileo himself and is a Copernican that believes in heliocentrism. One of them is an Aristotelian who believes in geocentrism. And one of them who is named after a friend then deceased already of Galileo, who is just an intelligent layperson who tries to hear the arguments on both sides and decide. Now, the way Galileo wrote the book, there is no question that he ridiculed the Aristotelian. Yes, he ridiculed him because the arguments that the Copernican shows are much stronger than what the Aristotelian is able to present. But because he knew what the Pope thought, he added a preface and a conclusion, which said something like, yeah, okay, well, this is how things are, but, God can do things however he wants and so on, and so we will never know, and things of that nature, which was the position of the Pope. The Pope's position was that, God is omnipotent and he can do things in a million different ways that we cannot even think about. And as a result of this, we will never know what is really there. And all these different models should only be taken as mathematical convenience to save the appearances, was the phrase used. You use a model to describe what is observed, but it doesn't mean that reality looks like that and that we will never really know what reality is. That was the Pope's position. And Galileo added a preface and a conclusion that kind of agreed with that. Now, at the trial, he was asked, first of all, okay, what do you think you wrote there? And he said, well, I think I wrote that is inconclusive. Then, they said, did you get permission to write the book? He said, well, I didn't think I need permission to write the book because I had this letter from Cardinal Bellarmino who said I just don't need to hold that opinion, but I can write, teach, and so on. But then they said, aha, but look, there is this thing that the Commissioner General of the Inquisition said that you're not allowed to do that. And he said, well, I didn't actually remember that because, it was many years earlier. You see, this was in 1616. His trial was only in 1633. So what I was guided by was the letter from Cardinal Bellarmino, which I hold in my hand. And that did not mention not to teach, not to write. So I didn't think I need to ask permission. Then they say, okay, did you have permission to print the book? I said, yes. In fact, I had two permissions, which was sort of true, but a little bit questionable in the sense that one permission was really true by the chief person in Florence. The one that came from Rome, that person never really saw the full text, was just sort of assured that there is this preface and conclusion and so on. So at that point, because there was that decision by the Commissioner General of the Inquisition, it was clear that the thing is going towards conviction. And that's where there are some ideas that maybe there was some sort of a plea bargain between the prosecutor and Galileo. Namely, that Galileo, will give an abjuration, will recant everything and so on. And as a result, things will be, easy. The Inquisition will be easy on him. Whether there was such a plea bargain or not is controversial. It's not clear. And if there was a plea bargain of any sort, what was the idea of that plea bargain? Was it just that he would not be put into torture and prison, only in house arrest, or was it that he was supposed to be, more or less acquitted? The fact is that he was found guilty, as vehemently suspected of heresy, and was put under house arrest, actually, for the rest of his life.
One other thing with his book that he wrote, when you mention these characters, there's the Copernican, the one who follows the Ptolemaic model. I believe in the book his name is Simplicio, which means fool or idiot, and he's basically repeating statements the Pope said. Is that correct?
Yeah, this is correct. Now, it is not true that it means an idiot.
Okay.
And his name actually is called after actually a known Aristotelian from history. Okay. The name, however, does mean in Italian also something of a simpleton. Mm-hmm. And he's the one representing the Pope. However, there have been studies which I think showed convincingly that Galileo did not really mean to insult the Pope. I mean, he was in many ways a friend of the Pope. There was a good relationship between them before the trial and all that. So it didn't mean to insult the Pope, but there were people around the Pope who saw this as seriously insulting the Pope. And the Pope was also in a delicate position politically and otherwise, psychologically. I mean, people were criticizing what he was doing, nepotism, he had nephews that, were in all kinds of high roles and things like that. So that didn't help Galileo's case. So the situation went from Galileo and the Pope being very, very good friends to a situation where the Pope was, very much against Galileo, other than the fact that at the end he wasn't put to torture or such things and so on. Now, mind you, he was also an old person at that point, so yeah.
Well, two interesting things that you mentioned. First, the Pope making the statement that because God is omnipotent, he can act in any manner. That seems to go against the Church's view of ordered creation and science as existed far back into the Middle Ages and Thomas Aquinas' description of the universe. And also with Galileo adding the introduction and conclusion to protect himself. That sounds to me the way that films that are filled with too much violence and nudity but want to have a rating, so a PG-13 rating to show to younger people, they'll remove scenes even though it doesn't really work with the rest of the film in order to protect himself. It sounds like he's safeguarding himself. Is that an accurate interpretation?
Maybe even not so much to safeguard himself, but to actually to get the book printed at all.
Right.
The book would not have been at all permitted to be printed because the Inquisition had complete control over which books could be printed or not. And without the preface and the conclusion, there was no way that this book could have been printed in Italy. So it was not so much only to protect him.